June 5, 1944. A suburban house in North London, England. Juan Pujol Garcia sat at his desk in the small upstairs room that served as his office, preparing to transmit the most important message of his life. It was approaching midnight, and outside the blacked-out windows of his modest home, the greatest invasion force in history was already moving. Thousands of ships crossing the English Channel toward the beaches of Normandy. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers embarking on the operation that would determine the outcome of World War II. But the Germans didn't know the invasion was coming. Not to Normandy. Not tonight. And if Pujol's deception worked, if the message he was about to transmit was believed, the Germans wouldn't know until it was too late to stop it. Pujol picked up the pencil and began encoding the message that would be transmitted to his German handlers in Madrid, who would forward it to German intelligence in Berlin. The message was lengthy, detailed, and carefully crafted to arrive at precisely the right time to be both believable and useless. The message warned that a major Allied invasion was imminent. It provided details on troop movements, shipping concentrations, and operational preparations. It was accurate, timely, and would confirm Pujol's credibility as the most important German spy in Britain. But the message was designed to arrive too late to stop the invasion, while being early enough to establish Pujol's reliability for the even more important deception that would follow. The deception that would convince the Germans that Normandy was a feint, that the real invasion was still coming at Pas-de-Calais, that they should keep their powerful reserves away from Normandy for weeks while the Allies established their beachhead. Pujol, whose German code name was Arabelle and whose British code name was Garbo, was the most successful double agent in history. He was a Spanish chicken farmer with no intelligence training, who had talked his way into working for both German and British intelligence, who had built an entirely fictional spy network that the Germans believed was real, and who was now executing a deception so perfect that it would save tens of thousands of Allied lives and ensure the success of D-Day. But the story of how Juan Pujol Garcia became Agent Garbo, how he created his fictional network from nothing, and how he convinced the Germans to believe lies that defied logic and evidence, is one of the most extraordinary tales of World War II. A story of deception, creativity, determination, and the strange power of telling people what they want to believe. This is that story. The story of a man who hated fascism so deeply that he fought both sides of the war to defeat it, who invented an entire fictional world that German intelligence accepted as real, and who executed the most successful deception operation in military history, despite having no qualifications, no training, and no resources beyond his own audacity and imagination. This is the story of how one Spanish chicken farmer saved D-Day through the power of creative lying, meticulous attention to detail, and an understanding of human psychology that would have impressed any intelligence professional despite his complete lack of formal training. To understand how Juan Pujol Garcia became Agent Garbo and how he executed the D-Day deception, we need to start at the beginning, with a Spanish chicken farmer who decided in 1941 that he wanted to fight the Nazis and who embarked on one of the most unlikely espionage careers in history. Juan Pujol Garcia was born on February 14, 1912, in Barcelona, Spain. He grew up in a middle-class family, had ordinary education, worked various jobs, managing a poultry farm, running a cinema, other small businesses. He was unremarkable in most ways, a typical Spanish civilian trying to make a living during turbulent times. But the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, radicalized Pujol. He served briefly on the Republican side, then deserted. hid, and survived the war by avoiding involvement with either Republicans or nationalists. The experience taught him that both fascism, represented by Franco's nationalists, and communism, represented by Soviet-backed Republicans, were totalitarian evils. He developed a deep hatred of both ideologies, and particularly of fascism, which seemed to be winning in Spain and spreading across Europe. When World War II began in 1939, Pujol was living in Madrid with his wife Araceli. Spain was neutral officially, but Franco's regime was sympathetic to Nazi Germany. Pujol, watching fascism triumph in Spain and threaten to conquer Europe, decided he wanted to help defeat the Nazis. This was an unusual decision for a Spanish civilian with no military experience, no intelligence background, and no obvious way to contribute to a war his country wasn't officially part of. But Pujol was determined. He believed fascism was evil and needed to be fought, and he had an idea for how he could fight it. Pujol decided to become a spy for the British. He would infiltrate German intelligence, gain their trust, and then provide false information that would help the British war effort. This plan was extraordinarily ambitious for someone with no intelligence training, no contacts with either German or British intelligence, and no apparent qualifications beyond determination and a creative mind. His first step was to contact the British. In January 1941, Pujol approached the British embassy in Madrid, explaining that he wanted to work as a spy for Britain against Germany. The British politely rejected him. He had no credentials, no background that suggested he would be useful, and no way to prove he wasn't a German plant or simply a delusional civilian. Pujol tried again, and again. The British continued to reject him. They weren't interested in recruiting unknown Spanish civilians who walked in off the street offering to spy. Intelligence work didn't work that way. But Pujol refused to give up. If the British wouldn't recruit him directly, he would recruit himself. He would approach the Germans, convince them to hire him as a spy against Britain, then take what the Germans gave him and use it to work for the British. It was a plan that could get him killed if either side discovered what he was doing. But Pujol was committed. In late 1941, Pujol approached the German embassy in Madrid. He presented himself as a Spanish fascist sympathizer who wanted to help Germany win the war. He claimed to have contacts in Britain through his work before the war, claimed he could travel to Britain and establish himself there, claimed he could recruit a network of agents to spy on British military preparations. The Germans were interested but cautious. They gave Pujol money and training materials, assigned him the codename Arabelle, and instructed him to travel to Britain and begin intelligence operations. They provided him with invisible ink, codes for communication, and instructions for setting up a spy network. Pujol had no intention of actually going to Britain. He couldn't, as he had no visa and no way to travel there during wartime. But he didn't tell the Germans this. Instead, he left Madrid, ostensibly traveling to Britain, and actually went to Lisbon, Portugal, where he settled into a hotel room and began one of the most audacious frauds in espionage history. From Lisbon, using a map of Britain, a tourist guidebook, a railway timetable, and a Portuguese library's reference materials, Pujol began sending intelligence reports to his German handlers, claiming to be operating in Britain. He invented observations about British military preparations, reported on shipping movements, described defenses and fortifications, and claimed to be recruiting a network of sub-agents across Britain. Everything was complete fiction. Pujol had never been to Britain. His observations were invented using his guidebook and imagination. His sub-agents were entirely fictional characters he created. a Venezuelan businessman in Glasgow, a Welsh nationalist, a Portuguese merchant seaman, a Swiss businessman in Bootle, eventually growing to a network of 27 fictional agents. The reports Pujol sent to his German handlers in Madrid, who forwarded them to German intelligence in Berlin, were detailed, plausible, and completely fabricated. He reported on convoy movements he invented using shipping schedules from newspapers. He described military installations he imagined based on his guidebook's city descriptions. He created elaborate cover stories for his fictional agents, explaining how he had recruited them and what intelligence they were gathering. The remarkable thing was that the Germans believed him. They believed Arabelle was operating a productive spy network in Britain, believed his reports were accurate, and paid him substantial amounts of money for his intelligence. They never suspected that their most important spy in Britain was actually sitting in a Lisbon hotel room making everything up. But Pujol's reports, while creative and detailed, contained errors that revealed he had never actually been to Britain. He reported British soldiers in Scotland drinking cider when Scottish soldiers drank beer or whiskey. He described a convoy sailing from Liverpool to Malta that would have had to sail across land to reach the Atlantic. He mentioned prices in shillings that were wildly wrong. He made the kinds of mistakes that someone working from guidebooks rather than direct observation would make. British intelligence, which intercepted and decoded some of Pujol's transmissions through their signals intelligence program Ultra, noticed these errors. They recognized that a German agent was operating, or claiming to operate, in Britain and was sending intelligence to Germany. But they also recognized that the intelligence was fabricated by someone who had never actually been to Britain. This created an opportunity. If the British could find this German agent who was already lying to the Germans, they could turn him into a double agent who would lie to the Germans on Britain's behalf. The search for Arabelle became a priority for British counterintelligence. Meanwhile, Pujol was becoming frustrated. He was spending his own money in Lisbon, living on limited funds, trying to maintain his elaborate deception with the Germans, while simultaneously trying to convince the British to take him seriously. He sent messages to the British embassy in Lisbon offering his services, explaining that he was already working for the Germans and could provide valuable intelligence. The British still didn't believe him. They thought he was a German plant trying to infiltrate British intelligence. The situation was absurd. British intelligence was searching for the German agent Arabelle, while simultaneously rejecting the very person who was Arabelle and was offering to work for them. The breakthrough came in early 1942 through a circuitous route. Pujol made contact with an American intelligence officer in Lisbon, who was more receptive than the British had been. The American realized that Pujol's story, while incredible, might actually be true. He contacted British intelligence and convinced them to at least interview Pujol. In April 1942, British intelligence officer Desmond Bristow interviewed Pujol in Lisbon. Bristow was initially skeptical but became convinced as Pujol explained his operation. Pujol provided his German codes, explained his fictional network, demonstrated his communication methods, and proved that he was indeed the German agent Arabelle that British intelligence had been searching for. Bristow immediately recognized Pujol's value. Here was a German agent who was already established, trusted by German intelligence, and completely controlled by the British. More importantly, here was someone with extraordinary creativity and attention to detail who could maintain elaborate deceptions indefinitely. In late April 1942, Pujol was smuggled into Britain and turned over to MI5, the British counterintelligence service. He was assigned to Thomas Harris, an MI5 officer who would become Pujol's handler, collaborator, and close friend for the rest of the war. Harris immediately recognized Pujol's potential. The fictional spy network that Pujol had invented could be developed, expanded, and used to feed false information to the Germans. If managed carefully, Arabelle and his network could become the most valuable deception asset the Allies possessed. The British gave Pujol a new code name, Garbo, after Greta Garbo, the actress, because MI5 officers believed Pujol was the greatest actor in the world for his ability to create and maintain his fictional persona and network. Harris and Pujol began expanding the fictional network. They took the characters Pujol had invented and developed them into detailed personalities with backstories, motivations, locations, and capabilities. Each fictional agent had a cover story explaining what he did for a living, how he had access to intelligence, and why he was willing to work as a spy. The network eventually included Agent 1, a Portuguese traveling salesman based in Lisbon, later relocated to Canada. Agent 2, a Swiss national working in Bootle. Agent 3, a Venezuelan businessman in Glasgow who recruited several sub-agents, including 3-1, a Greek deserter from the Merchant Navy, 2, a Scottish military officer 3-3, an American sergeant. Agent 4, a Spaniard working in Gibraltar who recruited 4-1, a guard at a military depot. 2, a wireless operator. 3, a pilot in the RAF agent. 5, a Welsh brother of Agent 3, Agent 6, a South African who recruited sub-agents in North Africa. Agent 7, a Welsh seaman who recruited 7-1, a Welsh soldier 7-2, an Indian poet in Brighton 3, a Welsh communist 7-4, a guard at a munitions depot 5, the treasurer of a military unit 6, a censor in the Ministry of Information 7, an American officer in the London headquarters. The network grew to 27 fictional agents, each with detailed backgrounds, each supposedly gathering intelligence from different locations and sources, each reporting to Garbo, who collated their intelligence and transmitted it to his German handlers. None of these agents existed. They were all fictional characters created by Pujol and Harris, maintained through meticulous record-keeping and careful attention to continuity. Every detail had to be tracked, where each fictional agent was supposedly located, what they were supposedly doing, what intelligence they supposedly had access to, what personal circumstances affected their availability. Maintaining the fiction required extraordinary attention to detail. If Agent 3-2, the Scottish military officer, reported being on leave in Edinburgh in one message, he couldn't report observing something in Glasgow the same week. If Agent 7 reported being at sea, he couldn't simultaneously be recruiting sub-agents in Wales. The network had to behave like real people with real limitations, real schedules, and real lives. Pujol and Harris developed elaborate systems for maintaining continuity. They kept detailed files on each fictional agent, tracking their movements, their relationships, their capabilities. They created personality traits for each character. Agent 3-2 was conscientious but slow to report. Agent 7-4 was efficient, but sometimes asked inappropriate questions that Garbo had to caution him about. They even created crises and personal dramas for the fictional agents to make them more believable. Agent 1 died, fictional illness, requiring an elaborate explanation to the Germans about the agent's death and the inheritance of his network to his widow. Agent 4's personality quirks created occasional problems that Garbo had to manage. Agent 7 got drunk occasionally and wrote confused messages. These human touches made the network believable. Real spy networks have problems, personality conflicts, communication failures, human drama. Pujol and Harris ensured that their fictional network had all the problems and complications that a real network would have, which paradoxically made the Germans more confident that the network was real. The intelligence that Garbo's network reported to the Germans was carefully crafted by MI5's 20 Committee, so named because XX represents double cross in Roman numerals, the organization that managed all of Britain's double agents. The 20 Committee decided what information should be passed to the Germans, how it should be presented, and when it should be transmitted. The art of strategic deception through double agents required careful balance. The information passed to the Germans had to be believable. It had to match what the Germans could verify from other sources. Valuable enough to keep the Germans interested and trusting. Garbo harmless or misleading, not actually helping the Germans in ways that would hurt Allied operations, building towards strategic deception, laying groundwork for the lies that would really matter. This meant that much of Garbo's intelligence was actually true, but carefully selected and timed. Garbo would report accurate information about military units, ship movements, and operational preparations, but only information that the Germans would learn anyway from other sources or that would arrive too late to be operationally useful. By providing accurate intelligence that arrived slightly too late to help, Garbo established his credibility. The Germans would receive his reports, verify them against other intelligence sources, confirm they were accurate, and increase their trust in Garbo without actually benefiting from the intelligence because by the time they received and verified it, the information was no longer actionable. This pattern, accurate but slightly late intelligence, was crucial for building Garbo's reputation. The Germans came to regard him as their most important source in Britain, the spy whose network provided the most comprehensive intelligence on British and American military preparations. Throughout 1942 and 1943, Garbo's fictional network provided intelligence on British military operations, all carefully crafted to build credibility while not actually helping the German war effort. When the Allies landed in North Africa in November 1942, Garbo sent advance warning, but the warning arrived too late for the Germans to respond effectively. The Germans verified that Garbo's intelligence had been accurate, increased their trust in him, but didn't benefit operationally. When the Allies invaded Sicily in July 1943, again Garbo provided intelligence, accurate details about troop concentrations and shipping movements that the Germans verified but received too late to counter the invasion effectively. Each operation reinforced Garbo's reputation as a reliable source while actually helping Allied operations succeed. By late 1943, German intelligence regarded Garbo as one of their most important assets. They paid him substantial sums of money, which MI5 kept, using it to fund counterintelligence operations. They gave him high-grade codes and communication equipment. They asked him detailed questions about Allied preparations, treating his intelligence as crucial for German strategic planning. The Germans had no idea that Garbo's entire network was fictional, that every report was crafted by British intelligence, that they were being systematically deceived by a former chicken farmer from Spain who was sitting in suburban London, inventing elaborate lies with the help of his British handler. And as 1944 began, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of France that would be the decisive operation of the European war, Garbo's fictional network was positioned to execute the most important deception operation in military history, convincing the Germans that D-Day was a diversion and that the real invasion was still coming. keeping German reserves away from Normandy for critical weeks while the Allies established their beachhead. This deception, known as Operation Fortitude, would be Garbo's masterpiece. Everything he and Harris had built over 2 years of meticulous lying would come together in a deception campaign that would save tens of thousands of Allied lives and ensure the success of the operation that would liberate Western Europe from Nazi occupation. January 1944. MI5 Headquarters, London. The 20 Committee gathered for one of the most important meetings in its history. The room was filled with intelligence officers, military planners, and deception specialists. On the wall hung maps of Britain and northern France, marked with the real locations of Allied forces and the fictional locations where German intelligence believed those forces to be. Juan Pujol Garcia sat among them, no longer just a Spanish refugee with a creative imagination, but now the centerpiece of the most ambitious deception operation ever conceived. His fictional spy network, which the Germans trusted implicitly, would be the primary vehicle for convincing Hitler that the D-Day landings in Normandy were merely a diversion, and that the real invasion would come weeks later at the Pas de Calais. The operation was called Fortitude, and it had 2 components. Fortitude North would convince the Germans that the Allies planned to invade Norway, forcing them to keep troops there that might otherwise reinforce France. Fortitude South would convince the Germans that when the invasion of France came, it would target Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, rather than Normandy. Garbo's network would be crucial to both operations, but especially to Fortitude South. Through his 27 fictional agents supposedly spread across Britain, Garbo would report on the massive buildup of Allied forces in southeastern England, forces that would supposedly invade Pas de Calais, but that were actually fictional, created through inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, false radio traffic, and reports from Garbo's non-existent agents. The deception had to be perfect. If the Germans discovered the ruse, if they realized that Garbo was a double agent feeding them lies, they would know that the real invasion was coming to Normandy and would concentrate their forces there. The result would be catastrophic casualties for Allied forces landing on the beaches, possibly outright failure of the invasion. The stakes couldn't be higher. Hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers' lives depended on German forces being positioned incorrectly on D-Day, on German reserves remaining at Pas de Calais for weeks after D-Day rather than rushing to Normandy. And achieving this depended largely on whether the Germans continued to believe the elaborate fiction that Pujol and Harris had been building for 2 years. Thomas Harris, Pujol's handler, outlined the plan. Starting in early 1944, Garbo's agents would begin reporting on Allied military preparations. The reports would be accurate regarding actual preparations. The buildup of forces in Britain was real and couldn't be hidden, but the reports would mislocate forces and misidentify their objectives. Agent 3, the Venezuelan businessman in Glasgow, would report on forces gathering in Scotland for the fictional Norway invasion. Agent 4 and his sub-agents in Gibraltar would report on Mediterranean forces that would supposedly support operations in southern France or the Balkans. But most crucially, Agent 7 and several sub-agents in southeastern England would report on the fictional 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, supposedly commanded by General George Patton and supposedly preparing to invade Pas de Calais. FUSAG was the heart of the Fortitude South deception. It was a fictional army group, but the Germans believed it was real because Garbo's agents reported seeing it, because Allied radio traffic suggested it existed, because aerial reconnaissance showed what appeared to be massive military concentrations in Kent and Sussex, actually inflatable tanks and plywood landing craft. and because German intelligence had been conditioned over 2 years to trust Garbo's reporting. The brilliance of using Garbo for this deception was that his network was already established, already trusted, and had a track record of providing accurate intelligence. The Germans had no reason to doubt him, because everything he had reported for 2 years had been verifiable. They didn't know that the verifiable intelligence had been carefully selected to be harmless, that Garbo had been a British asset from the beginning, that every accurate report had been building toward this moment when the lies would really matter. Through January, February, and March 1944, Garbo's agents began reporting on Allied preparations. The reports were voluminous, sometimes multiple messages per day, describing troop movements, identifying military units, noting shipping concentrations, reporting on exercises and training activities. The sheer volume of intelligence, the detail, the consistency across multiple independent agents, all of this reinforced German belief that Garbo's network was comprehensive and reliable. Agent 7's sub-agent 7-2, the Indian poet supposedly living in Brighton, reported on American troops in the area and on preparations at nearby ports. Agent 7-4, supposedly working as a guard at a munitions depot, reported on ammunition stocks and equipment movements. Agent 7-7, supposedly an American officer in London headquarters, provided insights into planning discussions and operational preparations. None of these agents existed. Every report was crafted by Pujol and Harris in their office in London, carefully calibrated to provide information that would build the deception without obviously contradicting information the Germans might receive from other sources. The work was extraordinarily demanding. Pujol and Harris had to maintain consistency across 27 fictional agents, each with different locations, different access to information, different reporting styles and capabilities. They had to ensure that information from multiple agents corroborated each other in ways that seemed natural rather than obviously coordinated. They had to create plausible delays and communications problems that would explain why some intelligence arrived late or was incomplete. They also had to manage the personal dramas of the fictional agents. Agent 4 had money problems and demanded more payment. Agent 7's sub-agent 7-3, the Welsh communist, became erratic and unreliable, requiring Garbo to explain to his German handlers that this agent was becoming a security risk. These touches of realism, these human complications, made the network more believable because real spy networks have exactly these kinds of problems. German intelligence was receiving Garbo's reports, analyzing them, comparing them to intelligence from other sources, and incorporating them into their assessment of Allied invasion planning. The German intelligence summary in March 1944 identified Fusag as the primary invasion force and predicted that the invasion would target Pas-de-Calais, exactly as Fortitude intended. But the deception couldn't simply be about providing false information before the invasion. The critical phase would come after D-Day, when Allied forces actually landed in Normandy. At that point, the Germans would see that an invasion was occurring in Normandy, and Fortitude South would need to convince them that Normandy was a diversion, that the real invasion by Fusag at Pas-de-Calais was still coming. This required extraordinarily careful timing and messaging. If Garbo simply insisted before D-Day that the invasion would be at Pas-de-Calais, and then the Normandy landings occurred, the Germans might conclude that Garbo had been wrong or had been deceived by Allied security. His credibility would be damaged exactly when it needed to be strongest. The solution was elegant and psychologically sophisticated. Garbo would warn the Germans shortly before D-Day that an invasion was imminent, that his agents were reporting final preparations, that something major was about to happen. This warning would be accurate. An invasion was about to happen, and would reach the Germans just before or during the initial stages of the Normandy landings. The Germans would receive Garbo's warning, would see that it was accurate, would have their trust in Garbo reinforced. But the warning would arrive too late to help them stop the invasion. The message would be sent late on June 5th and would reach German intelligence only hours before or during the initial Normandy landings. Then, immediately after the Normandy landings began, Garbo would send additional messages explaining that his agents had determined that Normandy was a diversion, that Fusag was still in southeastern England preparing for the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais, that the Allies were trying to draw German reserves away from Pas-de-Calais by attacking Normandy first. If the Germans believed this, they would keep their powerful reserve forces, particularly armored divisions that could devastate the Normandy beachhead, positioned at Pas-de-Calais rather than committing them to Normandy. The invasion would succeed not because Allied forces were overwhelmingly superior, but because German forces would be positioned in the wrong location based on deception. As June approached, the tension was extraordinary. The entire Allied deception effort had been building toward this moment. Thousands of people were involved in Fortitude, building dummy equipment, generating false radio traffic, creating the illusion of Fusag. But Garbo's reports to German intelligence were the centerpiece, the primary evidence that would convince German leadership that Pas-de-Calais was the real target. On June 1st, 1944, Pujol sent a message to his German handlers expressing frustration that despite his network's best efforts to penetrate Allied security, he still couldn't determine exactly when and where the invasion would occur. This message was psychologically important. It suggested that Garbo was trying, but was being stymied by Allied security, which made him seem more credible. A spy who claimed to know everything would be suspicious. A spy who acknowledged limitations while still providing valuable intelligence was believable. On June 5th, as Allied forces began boarding ships for the Channel crossing, Pujol prepared the crucial message that would cement his credibility. The message would warn that invasion was imminent based on reports from his agents observing final preparations. But the message would be transmitted late enough that it would reach the Germans too late to stop the invasion, while early enough to prove Garbo had tried to warn them. This timing was critical and had been debated extensively by the 20 Committee. Too early, and the Germans might actually use the warning effectively. Too late, and the Germans might conclude Garbo's intelligence had been useless. The window was narrow. The message needed to arrive at German intelligence in Madrid, which would relay it to Berlin, in the early morning hours of June 6th, after the invasion had already been launched, but before it was publicly known, giving the impression that Garbo had warned them in advance but they hadn't acted on his warning quickly enough. At 8:00 p.m. on June 5th, Pujol began transmitting his warning to Madrid. The transmission took 3 hours due to the length and the need for careful encoding. The message stated that his agents, particularly Agent 7's sub-agents in southern England, had observed massive military movements, embarkation of troops, and final invasion preparations. The message concluded that a major operation was imminent within hours and urged the Germans to take defensive measures. The message reached German intelligence in Madrid at approximately midnight on June 6th. The Madrid station tried to relay it immediately to Berlin, but encountered communications delays. By the time the message was decoded and forwarded to German military intelligence in Berlin, it was approximately 3:00 a.m. on June 6th, and the first waves of Allied paratroopers were already landing in Normandy. German intelligence officers receiving Garbo's warning in Berlin were stunned. One of their best agents had warned them hours before the invasion, But the warning had arrived too late for them to alert forces in France effectively. They blamed their own communications delays for failing to act on Garbo's intelligence, which perversely reinforced their trust in him. The agent had done his job, but German bureaucracy had failed to use the intelligence effectively. As dawn broke on June 6th and the Normandy landings became known to German commanders, the initial German response was confusion. Was this the main invasion or a diversion? Allied deception operations had been hinting at multiple possible invasion sites: Norway, Pas-de-Calais, Normandy, southern France. Now that Normandy was actually being invaded, was this the real operation or a feint? This is where Garbo's network became decisive. On June 9th, 3 days after D-Day, Pujol sent a lengthy message to his German handlers that ranks among the most important intelligence communications of World War II. The message, carefully crafted by Pujol and Harris, with input from the 20 Committee, drew on reports from Garbo's various agents to present a comprehensive analysis of the invasion. The message began by expressing Garbo's frustration that his warning of June 5th had apparently not been acted upon effectively, leading to the Germans being surprised by the Normandy landings. This established Garbo's credibility. He had tried to warn them, they had failed to act, and now they needed to trust his analysis of what the landings meant. The message then presented intelligence from multiple agents. Agent 7's sub-agents in southeastern England reported that Fusag remained in position, that the massive forces they had been observing for months were still there, that nothing had moved. Agent 77, the American officer supposedly in London headquarters, reported that planning staffs were still discussing the main operation that would follow the preliminary Normandy operation. The message concluded with Garbo's personal analysis, stating his professional opinion based on 2 years of observing Allied preparations. The Normandy landings were a large-scale diversion designed to draw German reserves away from Pas-de-Calais, where the main invasion by Fusag would occur in the following weeks. The message urged German commanders to resist the temptation to commit all their reserves to Normandy and instead to maintain strong forces at Pas-de-Calais to resist the coming main attack. This message was received at German military intelligence in Berlin and was forwarded to the highest levels of German command. It was read by Hitler himself, who found Garbo's analysis convincing. Hitler's military intuition, which was often catastrophically wrong, told him that the Allies would invade at the narrowest point of the Channel. Garbo's message confirmed Hitler's intuition, and Hitler ordered that strong forces be maintained at Pas-de-Calais despite the fighting in Normandy. The impact of this decision cannot be overstated. German forces in France included powerful armored divisions, particularly the 15th Army positioned in the Pas-de-Calais region, that could have been committed to Normandy in the critical days after D-Day. These forces, particularly panzer divisions with heavy tanks, could have counterattacked the beachhead before the Allies had fully established themselves, potentially driving Allied forces back into the sea. But Hitler, convinced by Garbo's message that Pas-de-Calais was the real target and Normandy was a diversion, ordered these forces to remain in position. The 15th Army, with approximately 150,000 men and significant armor, stayed at Pas-de-Calais, defending against an invasion that would never come. The panzer divisions that could have devastated the Normandy beachhead remained waiting for Fusag to attack. Allied forces in Normandy, instead of facing the full weight of German forces in France, faced only the forces already in the Normandy sector. While the fighting was still brutal and casualties were heavy, the absence of the 15th Army and the uncommitted panzer reserves meant that Allied forces could establish and expand their beachhead without facing counterattacks that might have destroyed them. For weeks after D-Day, Garbo's fictional agents continued reporting that Fusag was preparing for the main invasion. Agent 7 reported on continued military concentrations in southeastern England. Agent 77 sent intelligence on planning discussions for the Pas de Calais operation. The reports were detailed, consistent, and corroborated by other German intelligence indicating that Allied forces remained in southeastern England. Actually, the dummy installations and inflatable equipment of Fortitude South. German intelligence, trusting Garbo's proven track record, continued to assess that the main invasion was coming at Pas de Calais. Hitler continued to order that strong forces be maintained there. Through June and into July 1944, as Allied forces in Normandy expanded their beachhead, broke out of the Bocage country, and began advancing across France, powerful German forces remained positioned at Pas de Calais, waiting for an invasion that existed only in Juan Pujol Garcia's imagination. The deception began to unravel only in late July, when the scale of Allied forces in Normandy made it clear that this was indeed the main invasion and that no second invasion was coming. By then, it was too late. Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were advancing rapidly across France. The forces that had been held at Pas de Calais were finally committed to combat, but they entered the battle piecemeal, too late to stop the Allied advance. Military historians estimate that Garbo's deception kept German reserves away from Normandy for approximately 6 weeks after D-Day, during the critical period when Allied forces were establishing and expanding their beachhead. The casualties saved by this deception are impossible to calculate precisely, but estimates range from tens of thousands to potentially over 100,000 Allied lives saved because German forces were positioned based on false intelligence rather than committed to Normandy immediately. The Germans never realized that Garbo had deceived them. Even after the war, captured German intelligence officers expressed continued belief that Garbo had been a genuine agent whose intelligence had been accurate, but whose warnings about Pas de Calais had been validated too late because the Allies had changed their plans. They never understood that Fusag had never existed, that Garbo's agents were fictional, that they had been systematically deceived by a Spanish chicken farmer and his British handler. In fact, the Germans' trust in Garbo was so complete that they awarded him the Iron Cross, Germany's military decoration for bravery and service. In one of history's great ironies, Juan Pujol Garcia, who had worked tirelessly to defeat Nazi Germany, received a medal from Hitler for his service to the German war effort. Simultaneously, the British awarded him the Member of the Order of the British Empire, MBE, for his service to Britain. Pujol remains the only person to have received high military decorations from both Germany and Britain during World War II, having been honored by both sides for the same work that was actually helping Britain while appearing to help Germany. The technical sophistication of maintaining the Garbo deception through the D-Day period deserves emphasis. Pujol and Harris were not simply making up random lies. They were executing a carefully orchestrated deception that required consistency across multiple sources. The 27 fictional agents had to report information that was mutually consistent, that corroborated without seeming obviously coordinated, that painted a coherent picture from multiple independent perspectives. Timing precision. Messages had to arrive at specific times to achieve specific effects. The June 5th warning had to arrive too late to stop D-Day, but early enough to reinforce credibility. The June 9th analysis had to arrive after the Normandy landings, but before German commanders had committed their reserves. Psychological sophistication. The messages had to appeal to German preconceptions, had to confirm what German commanders wanted to believe, that the invasion would come at the obvious location, Pas de Calais, had to present the deception as analysis rather than as simple reporting. Integration with physical deception. Garbo's reports had to match what German aerial reconnaissance would see in southeastern England, the dummy installations, what German signals intelligence would intercept, false radio traffic from Fusag, what other intelligence sources would report. Management of expectations. The Germans had to be kept believing in the Pas de Calais invasion long enough for it to matter operationally, but the deception couldn't be so absolute that its eventual failure would discredit Garbo completely for possible future use. Maintaining all of these elements simultaneously over weeks and months, while knowing that errors could cost hundreds of thousands of lives, required extraordinary discipline and attention to detail. Pujol and Harris worked essentially around the clock during the critical periods, encoding messages, maintaining records, coordinating with the 20 Committee, ensuring that every detail of their elaborate fiction remained consistent and believable. The stress on Pujol personally was immense. He had been living a double life for 3 years, pretending to his German handlers to be a Nazi sympathizer while actually working for the British he admired. He was responsible for deceiving an enemy intelligence service that would execute him if they discovered his deception. He knew that millions of lives depended on his ability to maintain his lies convincingly. July 1944. London. As Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began their sweep across France, Juan Pujol Garcia sat in his modest London office and contemplated a problem that was both bizarre and unprecedented in the history of espionage: how to gracefully retire a fictional spy network that had just executed the most successful deception in military history. The Garbo network couldn't simply disappear. The Germans still believed in it, still trusted it, still considered Garbo their most valuable intelligence asset. If the network simply went silent, German intelligence would suspect something had gone wrong. Either that Garbo had been captured by British counterintelligence, or that he had been a double agent all along. Either conclusion would lead the Germans to question everything Garbo had reported, including the Pas de Calais deception, potentially revealing to them how thoroughly they had been deceived. But maintaining the network indefinitely was also problematic. The war was entering its final phase. Allied victory was increasingly certain. The Germans were retreating on all fronts. At some point, Garbo's network would outlive its usefulness, and the elaborate fiction that Pujol and Harris had maintained for 3 years would need to be concluded in a way that didn't reveal the deception. The solution they developed was characteristically creative. The Garbo network would be slowly wound down through a combination of attrition, personal complications, and the changing military situation. Agents would die, would be arrested by British security services, would flee Britain as Allied victory became certain and their cover stories became untenable. Agent 7, who had been one of the most productive sources during the D-Day period, was arrested by British counterintelligence in July 1944. Garbo sent an urgent message to his German handlers explaining that Agent 7 had been caught, that his network in southern England was compromised, that Garbo himself might be in danger. This created drama and urgency while reducing the network's supposed capabilities. Other agents gradually became less productive. Agent 4's sub-agents in Gibraltar provided less intelligence as the war moved away from the Mediterranean. Agent 3's sub-agents in Scotland reported less after the fictional Norway invasion threat was no longer relevant. The network, which had been at peak productivity during the D-Day deception, naturally contracted as the operational situation changed. But even as the network contracted, Pujol and Harris continued to demonstrate the meticulous attention to detail that had made Garbo successful. Each agent's decline was explained through plausible personal circumstances. Each message maintained the established character voices and communication styles. The fiction was maintained until the very end, even when its strategic importance had diminished. Through late 1944 and into 1945, as Allied forces advanced into Germany and victory became imminent, Garbo continued reporting to his German handlers. The intelligence was less operationally significant. There were no more major deceptions to execute, no more strategic operations where German misperception would determine outcomes. But maintaining contact with the Germans served the purpose of preventing them from realizing they had been deceived. In one of the final communications, Garbo expressed concern about what would happen to him after the war. He had served Germany loyally, or so the Germans believed, had risked his life for years spying in Britain, and now faced potential arrest as a Nazi collaborator when the war ended. What provisions would Germany make for agents who had served them? This message was psychologically sophisticated on multiple levels. It reinforced Garbo's cover by showing appropriate concern for his safety. It allowed the British to gauge German intentions toward their agents, and it set up a potential cover story for why Garbo might disappear after the war. He would go into hiding to avoid prosecution as a Nazi collaborator. The Germans responded with assurances that Garbo's service would be remembered and rewarded, that provisions would be made for loyal agents after the war. They confirmed that Garbo would receive the Iron Cross, Germany's decoration for military valor, which was secretly awarded to him in July 1944, though he never physically received the medal. It was sent to his German handlers in Madrid, who held it for him. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Garbo operation officially ended. Pujol sent a final message to his German handlers expressing his distress at Germany's defeat and his intention to go into hiding to avoid arrest by Allied authorities. He then went silent, allowing the Germans to believe that their most important British agent was on the run from Allied counterintelligence. In reality, Pujol was safe in London, debriefing with MI5 about his 3 years of operation, preparing to return to civilian life, and contemplating the extraordinary thing he had accomplished. The full scope of what Garbo had achieved was still being assessed. MI5 and military intelligence officers were conducting post-operation analysis, interviewing captured German intelligence officers, examining captured German documents, trying to understand exactly how the deception had worked and what impact it had on German decision-making. The evidence was overwhelming. German intelligence records showed that they had complete faith in Garbo through the end of the war. They had based strategic assessments on his reporting. They had committed forces based on his intelligence. Hitler himself had read Garbo's messages and had made decisions based on them. Captured German intelligence officers, when asked about their sources in Britain, consistently identified Garbo/Arabelle as their best agent, the source whose intelligence had been most comprehensive and reliable. When interrogators revealed that Garbo had been a British double agent, that his entire network had been fictional, that every message had been crafted by British intelligence, many German officers refused to believe it. Some German intelligence officers maintained for years after the war that Garbo must have been genuine, that the British were lying about controlling him to protect other sources, that the intelligence he had provided was too detailed and accurate to have been fabricated. They couldn't accept that they had been so thoroughly deceived by a completely fictional network invented by a Spanish chicken farmer with no intelligence training. This reaction revealed something profound about deception, that people who have invested belief in something, who have built conclusions on that belief, who have committed to actions based on those conclusions, are extraordinarily resistant to admitting they were wrong. German intelligence officers' professional reputations and personal identities were tied to having correctly assessed their sources. Admitting that Garbo had deceived them completely would mean admitting professional failure of catastrophic magnitude. The military impact of Garbo's deception has been debated by historians, but is generally assessed as decisive for D-Day's success. The specific question is, what would have happened if German reserves, particularly the 15th Army at Pas-de-Calais and uncommitted panzer divisions, had been thrown into the Normandy battle immediately after D-Day, rather than being held back for 6 weeks based on Garbo's deception? Military historians have conducted extensive analysis of this counterfactual, using actual German force dispositions, Allied capabilities, and the tactical situation in Normandy. The consensus is that if German reserves had been committed immediately, the Normandy invasion would have succeeded, but at far higher cost and with delayed timeline. Specific estimates vary, but most historians suggest casualties. Allied casualties in Normandy would have been 50 to 100% higher if German reserves had been committed immediately. Instead of approximately 73,000 Allied casualties in the first 2 months of the Normandy campaign, casualties might have reached 100,000, 150,000 or more. Timeline. The breakout from Normandy, which occurred in late July, would likely have been delayed by weeks or possibly months if German forces had been positioned correctly. This would have delayed the liberation of France and possibly extended the European war into late 1945 or beyond. Success, probability. Most historians assess that the invasion would ultimately have succeeded even with German reserves committed immediately, because Allied material superiority was overwhelming. But the margin was closer than comfortable, and a combination of bad weather, German tactical skill, and Allied mistakes could have turned immediate commitment of German reserves into a crisis or even failure. The conclusion is that Garbo's deception was not absolutely decisive for success. The invasion would likely have succeeded anyway, but it was decisive for the cost of success and the timeline of victory. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers who survived Normandy and went home after the war owed their survival to the fact that German forces were positioned incorrectly based on Garbo's lies. This impact justifies describing Garbo's deception as one of the most consequential intelligence operations in history. Very few intelligence operations can be directly linked to saving tens of thousands of lives and shortening a major war by months. Garbo's operation achieved both. For Juan Pujol Garcia personally, the end of the war brought complex emotions and difficult decisions. He had spent 3 years living a lie, pretending to be someone he wasn't, maintaining fictional identities, deceiving an enemy intelligence service that would have killed him if they had discovered his deception. The stress had been enormous, and the end of the war brought relief but also a sense of displacement. What does someone do after saving D-Day? How do you return to normal life after executing the most successful deception in military history? These were questions Pujol struggled with in the immediate post-war period. The British government wanted to recognize his service. He was awarded the Member of the Order of the British Empire, MBE, in a ceremony in late 1945. The decoration was given for services to the Allied cause, a vague description that couldn't reveal the actual nature of his work because the Garbo operation remained highly classified. Pujol's wife Araceli, who had been aware of his work and had assisted in maintaining his cover, was also recognized by the British government. She had lived through 3 years of tension, knowing that her husband was conducting dangerous espionage work, helping maintain the fiction when necessary, and raising their children while the fate of millions hung on her husband's ability to lie convincingly. But recognition and awards couldn't solve the practical problem of what Pujol would do next. His intelligence work had been so secret that he couldn't discuss it publicly. He couldn't use it as a credential for employment. He couldn't leverage his extraordinary accomplishments into career opportunities because almost no one knew what he had done. Moreover, there was a security concern. German intelligence officers who had worked with Arabelle were still alive, many of them in British or American custody, but some having disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe. If Pujol's identity became publicly known, if Germans realized that the Spanish agent Arabelle had actually been Juan Pujol Garcia working for the British, there might be revenge attempts from bitter former Nazis. For these reasons, limited employment prospects and security concerns, Pujol decided to disappear. He moved to Venezuela in 1949 using money he had received from both British recognition and from the Germans, who had paid him substantial sums during the war that MI5 had kept and later gave to him. He settled in Caracas under a different name, started a small business, and lived quietly. For the next 25 years, Juan Pujol Garcia was presumed dead by most people who had known him. British intelligence lost contact with him. His family in Spain believed he had died. Even MI5, which had worked so closely with him, had no idea where he was or whether he was still alive. Pujol had chosen to disappear because he wanted a normal life, wanted to escape the tension and deception of his wartime years, wanted to start fresh where nobody knew him as Garbo. He married again. His marriage to Araceli had fallen apart after the war, partly due to the stress of their wartime experiences. Raised a family, ran his business, and told no one in Venezuela about his wartime service. But in 1984, a British writer named Nigel West, who specialized in intelligence history, began researching double-agent operations during World War II. West became fascinated by the Garbo case, which had been partially declassified. He wanted to find out what had happened to Juan Pujol Garcia, whether he was still alive, whether he would be willing to tell his story. West conducted an extensive search, following leads through Spain and Portugal, eventually tracking Pujol to Venezuela. In 1984, West contacted Pujol, who was now 72 years old, and asked if he would be willing to talk about his wartime experiences. Pujol initially refused. He had spent 35 years away from that life, had built a new identity, had no desire to revisit the stress and deception of his wartime service. But West was persistent, and eventually Pujol agreed to limited cooperation. He would provide information for a book about the Garbo operation, but would maintain his privacy and security. The result was the book Garbo by Nigel West, published in 1985, which told the full story of Pujol's deception for the first time. The book revealed details of the operation that had remained classified for 40 years, explained how the fictional network had been created and maintained, and documented the impact of the deception on D-Day and the Normandy campaign. The book's publication brought Pujol unexpected recognition. He was invited to Britain in 1984, where he met with former MI5 officers who had worked on the Garbo operation, visited locations associated with his wartime work, and was received by the British government as a hero whose contribution to victory was finally being properly recognized. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, met with Pujol and expressed Britain's gratitude for his service. British military historians interviewed him about technical details of the operation. He was celebrated in British media as the spy who saved D-Day, the unsung hero whose work had been classified for 40 years. In 1988, Pujol returned to Britain for D-Day anniversary commemorations. He visited Normandy, walking on the beaches where Allied soldiers had landed in 1944, knowing that his deception had helped ensure those soldiers' survival. He met with veterans who had landed on D-Day, and while he couldn't claim direct credit, the Garbo operation remained partially classified. He knew that he had contributed to their survival. The recognition Pujol received in the 1980s and early 1990s was bittersweet. He was gratified that his work was finally being acknowledged, that history was recognizing his contribution to Allied victory. But he was also melancholic about the years that had passed, about his handler Thomas Harris, who had died in 1964, never knowing whether Pujol had survived, about the stress and deception that had characterized his wartime years. In interviews during this period, Pujol was modest about his accomplishments. He emphasized that he had not acted alone, that Harris and the 20 Committee had been essential to the operation's success, that many other double agents and deception operations had contributed to D-Day's success. He resisted characterizations of himself as a lone hero, insisting that victory had required collective effort. But he also expressed satisfaction that his work had mattered, that his deception had saved lives, that his hatred of fascism, which had driven him to volunteer as a spy in 1941, had translated into concrete contribution to fascism's defeat. He had wanted to fight the Nazis, had found a way to do it that matched his unique capabilities, and had executed that fight with skill and determination. Juan Pujol Garcia died on October 10, 1988, in Caracas, Venezuela, at age 76. His obituaries in British newspapers were extensive, detailing his extraordinary wartime service and his contribution to D-Day's success. The Spanish government, which had been neutral during World War II and had complex relationships with both wartime sides, gave Pujol limited recognition, acknowledging his service but not celebrating it extensively. The legacy of Juan Pujol Garcia and the Garbo operation extends beyond the specific impact on D-Day. The operation demonstrated several principles about intelligence, deception, and human psychology that remain relevant. Belief is more powerful than evidence. The Germans believed in Garbo because they wanted to believe, because his intelligence confirmed their preconceptions, because admitting he was false would mean admitting they had been wrong. Even when evidence contradicted Garbo's reports, the Germans reinterpreted evidence to maintain their belief, rather than questioning the source. Consistency and detail create credibility. Garbo's network was believed partly because it was so detailed, so comprehensive, so consistent across multiple sources. The Germans couldn't imagine that such detail could be fabricated, that Pujol and Harris could maintain such elaborate consistency without the network being real. Human elements enhance deception. The personal dramas of Garbo's fictional agents, their deaths, arrests, personal conflicts, made the network seem more real. Perfect sources are suspicious. Imperfect sources with human complications are believable. Strategic deception requires patience. Garbo spent 2 years building credibility before executing the D-Day deception. The operation succeeded because that foundation had been laid carefully, because the Germans had learned to trust Garbo through accumulated experience, because the deception was the culmination of long preparation. Simplicity can be more effective than sophistication. Garbo's operation was conceptually simple, one man inventing fictional agents and sending false reports. But that simplicity made it robust. There were no complex systems to fail, no extensive networks to be penetrated. The operation succeeded through meticulous execution of a simple concept. Modern intelligence services study the Garbo operation as a masterclass in deception. It is taught at intelligence training schools, analyzed in academic studies of military deception, and cited in discussions of influence operations and strategic deception. The specific tactics Pujol used, creating fictional networks, building credibility through accurate but useless intelligence, executing major deceptions only after extensive preparation, remain relevant to contemporary intelligence operations. The story also resonates beyond intelligence circles because it demonstrates how individuals can have strategic impact through unconventional means. Pujol had no formal qualifications, no intelligence training, no resources beyond his creativity and determination. Yet he executed an operation that changed the course of history, that saved tens of thousands of lives, that contributed decisively to defeating one of history's most evil regimes. This accessibility, the fact that Pujol was an ordinary person who accomplished extraordinary things, makes his story compelling. He wasn't a trained spy or a military genius or a government official with resources and authority. He was a chicken farmer who hated fascism, who volunteered to fight it in whatever way he could, and who discovered that his particular talents for creative lying and attention to detail could be weaponized against the Nazis. The story also illustrates the strange morality of intelligence work. Pujol spent 3 years lying constantly, maintaining elaborate deceptions, pretending to be someone he wasn't. In ordinary life, such behavior would be considered dishonest and contemptible. But in the context of World War II, Pujol's lies saved lives, helped defeat evil, and contributed to one of the most morally justified wars in history. This paradox, that dishonesty in service of a just cause becomes honorable, is central to intelligence work and creates moral complexities that Pujol himself seemed to struggle with. He was proud of what he had accomplished, but also seemed uncomfortable with the deception required to accomplish it. He had been, in essence, a professional liar whose lies were heroic rather than contemptible because of the cause they served. The relationship between Pujol and Thomas Harris, his British handler, was central to the operation's success, but remains somewhat mysterious. The two men worked together for 3 years in extraordinary intimacy, creating and maintaining the fictional network, encoding messages, managing crises, executing the D-Day deception. They developed deep trust and understanding, with Harris recognizing Pujol's genius for deception and Pujol trusting Harris's guidance and protection. But after the war, they lost contact. Harris died in 1964 in a car accident in Spain, never knowing whether Pujol had survived or what had happened to him. Pujol learned of Harris's death only in the 1980s when he re-emerged from obscurity. He expressed profound sadness that he and Harris had never reconnected, that Harris had died not knowing the outcome of Pujol's life. This separation reflects the nature of intelligence work. Relationships formed under extraordinary circumstances often cannot be maintained after those circumstances end. Pujol and Harris had been partners in deception, but that partnership was specific to wartime conditions and couldn't easily translate to peacetime friendship. In the final assessment, Juan Pujol Garcia deserves recognition as one of World War II's most important figures, despite his relative obscurity. The number of people who directly changed the war's outcome is limited. Political leaders, military commanders, scientists who developed crucial technologies. Pujol belongs in that category, despite never commanding troops, never developing weapons, never holding political office. His weapon was imagination. His battlefield was the minds of German intelligence officers. His strategy was to make them believe what they wanted to believe, and to maintain that belief long enough for it to become catastrophically wrong. And his victory was measured not in territory captured or enemies killed, but in Allied soldiers who survived because German forces were positioned incorrectly based on his lies. The Germans gave him the Iron Cross for service to Germany. The British gave him the MBE for service to Britain. Both decorations were for the same work that was actually helping Britain while appearing to help Germany. This bizarre duality captures the essence of double-agent operations and the strange achievement of being honored by both sides of a conflict for defeating one side while pretending to serve it. Today, nearly 80 years after D-Day, the beaches of Normandy are peaceful. Memorials commemorate the soldiers who died there. Cemeteries hold those who never came home. Tourists visit to understand one of history's pivotal moments. Few of those tourists know that the invasion succeeded partly because a Spanish chicken farmer sitting in suburban London invented an entire fictional spy network and convinced the Germans it was real. Few know that German reserves that could have slaughtered Allied soldiers on those beaches were instead positioned at Pas de Calais, based on lies created by Juan Pujol Garcia. His contribution is not memorialized with monuments or plaques. His name is not widely known outside intelligence history circles. But the soldiers who survived D-Day, who went home to build families and live the lives that Pujol's deception helped preserve, are his memorial. Their survival, their children and grandchildren, the lives they lived. These are the evidence of what Pujol accomplished. The spy who saved D-Day did it with nothing but creativity, determination, and the understanding that sometimes the most powerful weapon is a perfectly crafted lie told to people who desperately want to believe it. Juan Pujol Garcia proved that intelligence and imagination could be as decisive as military force. That one person could change history through the power of deception, and that heroism sometimes looks nothing like what we expect. He volunteered to fight fascism when no one would recruit him. He talked his way into German intelligence and then turned their own trust against them. He invented an entire fictional world and maintained it for 3 years with meticulous consistency. He executed the most successful deception operation in military history. And then he disappeared into quiet obscurity until history rediscovered him 40 years later. That is the story of Juan Pujol Garcia, Agent Garbo, Agent Arabelle, the spy with 2 codenames, the man who received decorations from both sides, the chicken farmer who became the greatest double agent in history, the hero who saved D-Day and then vanished because he didn't need recognition or fame or glory. He just needed to defeat fascism, and he did it in the most unlikely way imaginable, by becoming the spy that nobody expected, the deceiver who deceived the deceivers, the man who proved that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through force but through the perfect lie told at exactly the right moment to exactly the right people. The Germans never realized they had been deceived. They died believing Garbo been genuine. And that perfect deception, maintained from 1942 to 1945 and beyond, stands as the ultimate measure of Pujol's success. That even in defeat, even with access to all the evidence, even with captured documents and interrogations, the Germans couldn't accept that the Spanish agent they had trusted completely had been lying to them perfectly for 3 years. That is the achievement of Juan Pujol Garcia. The impossible deception that succeeded so completely that even the deceived refused to believe they had been deceived. The spy who saved D-Day through imagination, determination, and the understanding that in intelligence work, The most powerful truth is sometimes a lie so perfect that it becomes more believable than reality itself.